In this episode, we're going to focus on the point where monitoring and governance become real for leadership: escalation triggers. Beginners often assume escalation is simply what happens when something goes wrong, but a mature risk program treats escalation as a planned decision pathway that activates before harm becomes severe. AI makes this planning especially important because AI systems can scale mistakes quickly, can create subtle patterns of unfairness, and can degrade quietly through drift while people continue trusting the outputs. If an organization waits until a major incident forces leadership involvement, decisions will be rushed, information will be incomplete, and trust will be harder to protect. Escalation triggers are the specific conditions that tell the organization it is time to involve leadership, either because risk has exceeded tolerance, because controls are failing, or because the potential impact is too high to be handled at an operational level. Well-designed triggers protect the organization in two ways at once. They ensure serious issues reach decision-makers in time, and they reduce over-escalation that overwhelms leadership with noise. By the end, you should understand what escalation triggers are, why they matter for AI risk, how they connect to key risk indicators, KRIS, and risk tolerance, and how to design triggers that are clear, enforceable, and defensible. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong way to understand escalation triggers is to see them as the bridge between measurement and authority. Monitoring can tell you that something is changing, but monitoring cannot decide what level of risk is acceptable, and monitoring cannot allocate resources or accept risk on behalf of the enterprise. Leadership has the authority to set risk appetite, approve major trade-offs, allocate budgets, and defend decisions under scrutiny, which means leadership must be involved when the decision crosses a certain threshold of impact or exposure. Escalation triggers therefore define when operational teams must stop treating an issue as a local problem and start treating it as an enterprise decision. This is not about fear or blame. It is about matching decision rights to risk magnitude. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking escalation is optional, like a courtesy update, when in a mature program escalation is a control requirement. If triggers are defined and the organization ignores them, governance is not operating because tolerance boundaries are being exceeded without the required decision-maker involvement. Conversely, if triggers are too vague, teams will either over-escalate to protect themselves or under-escalate to avoid attention. Clear triggers remove that ambiguity and make the program more consistent. The first category of escalation triggers is tolerance breaches, because tolerance boundaries are meant to define what is acceptable. If an AI system's risk indicators cross a defined threshold, such as a rise in serious misclassifications, an increase in disparities, or a drift signal beyond an acceptable range, that may mean residual risk is no longer within tolerance. When risk exceeds tolerance, leadership needs to decide whether to accept additional risk temporarily, invest in stronger controls, restrict the use case, or pause the system. Tolerance breaches can be defined through KRI thresholds, but the important concept is that the threshold must be tied to action, not just to observation. For high-impact systems, tolerance breaches should trigger faster escalation because the cost of delay is higher. For low-impact systems, a breach might trigger internal review first, with escalation only if the trend persists or the potential harm increases. Beginners should recognize that tolerance breaches are not just numbers. They represent crossing a boundary the organization said it would not cross without leadership decision. That boundary is part of defensibility, because if a regulator or auditor asks why a risky system continued operating, leadership needs evidence that it was either within tolerance or that a documented decision was made to accept risk temporarily. Escalation triggers are the mechanism that ensures those decisions are made deliberately. The second category is impact escalation, meaning certain types of harm or certain contexts require leadership attention even if metrics are not yet showing a breach. For example, if an AI system influences safety roles or critical decisions affecting rights, leadership may need to be involved whenever a significant change occurs, such as expanding to a new population or changing the decision pathway from advisory to determinative. Impact escalation recognizes that in high-stakes contexts, the organization may have very low tolerance for uncertainty, and leadership must approve major changes in reliance or scope. Impact escalation also applies when harm is severe but rare, because early warning metrics may not capture the risk until it is too late. For instance, a safety-related misclassification might be rare, but one event can be catastrophic, so leadership may want to be informed when any credible safety incident or near miss occurs. A beginner mistake is to treat impact as just a label used during classification and then ignore it during operations. In a mature program, impact classification influences escalation design because high-impact contexts require faster and more conservative escalation. Impact escalation keeps the organization from being blindsided by saying that metrics looked fine while a serious harm was still possible. It is a reminder that leadership decisions are not only about trends, but also about consequence severity. The third category is control failure escalation, because sometimes the biggest risk is not that the model is wrong, but that the governance controls meant to catch issues are not operating. Control failures include missing monitoring reviews, expired exceptions, missing documentation, unclear ownership, or failure to perform required human review steps. When controls fail, the organization loses the ability to detect and respond to risk, which means residual risk can rise quickly even if the system's outputs appear stable. Leadership should be involved when control failures affect high-impact systems, because operating a high-impact AI use case without controls is not defensible. Control failure escalation is also important because it reveals resource strain or process design problems, such as a monitoring cadence that is unrealistic or a review process that teams cannot keep up with. If control failures become frequent, leadership may need to allocate resources, adjust priorities, or redesign the operating model to restore control health. For beginners, it is crucial to understand that governance is itself a control system, and control failures are risk events. If a risk program cannot prove that controls are operating, it cannot prove that risk is managed. Escalation triggers that include control health prevent the organization from living in governance theater. The fourth category is incident escalation, which is what most people think of first, but it needs to be defined carefully so it does not become purely reactive. Incidents include confirmed harms, such as privacy breaches, discriminatory outcomes, customer harm, or operational disruptions caused by AI outputs. Incident escalation should also include near misses and significant complaints, because those often predict larger harm if ignored. In AI, incident escalation should consider the possibility that the AI contributed indirectly, such as by influencing a human decision that led to harm. That indirect influence can be overlooked if the organization treats incidents as only technical failures, which is why incident intake and classification matter. Leadership should be involved when incidents affect high-impact decisions, when incidents attract external attention, when legal obligations are triggered, or when the incident suggests systemic risk. Incident escalation should also be tied to corrective actions, such as pausing the system, restricting scope, issuing communications, or initiating deeper investigations. Beginners should see that escalation is not only about notifying leaders. It is about enabling decisions and resources that operational teams may not have authority to enact. When incident escalation is defined and practiced, response becomes faster and more coordinated, which reduces harm and protects trust. The fifth category is external exposure escalation, which includes situations where external scrutiny or obligations require leadership involvement even if internal metrics are not alarming. External exposure can include regulatory inquiries, audit findings, media attention, or contractual disputes related to AI decisions. It can also include new regulatory requirements or guidance that change what is defensible, especially for high-impact decisions. If the organization learns that a major customer or partner is concerned about AI use, leadership may need to be involved because the relationship and reputation implications are enterprise level. External exposure escalation is also relevant when vendors change terms, data handling behaviors, or model features in ways that affect obligations, because leadership may need to decide whether to continue the relationship or impose new requirements. Beginners sometimes assume escalation is entirely internal, but in real organizations, external pressures often determine urgency and required response. Leadership is responsible for reputational and legal posture, so external exposure triggers should be defined clearly. This protects the organization from being slow to respond to external events and from making inconsistent statements that increase trust harm. A mature program treats external exposure as part of risk monitoring, not as a surprise event that happens after a crisis is public. Escalation triggers must also include clear routing, because a trigger is useless if teams do not know who to notify and what the escalation path is. Routing should specify whether the issue goes to an AI governance committee, to a risk leadership group, to a specific executive sponsor, or to a broader enterprise risk forum. It should also specify what information must accompany the escalation, because leadership needs a brief that includes what happened, what the impact could be, what evidence exists, what controls were in place, what actions have been taken so far, and what decision is needed. This is where your skill in executive translation becomes important, because leaders need a clear, outcome-focused summary without technical fog. Routing should also clarify timelines, meaning whether the escalation must happen immediately, within a day, or at the next scheduled review, depending on impact. For high-impact systems, timelines should be shorter because delay increases exposure. For lower-impact systems, escalation can be less urgent, but it still needs a predictable path so issues do not linger. Beginners should understand that escalation is a process control, not an emotional reaction, and process controls require clear steps and clear ownership. When routing is clear, teams escalate promptly without fear because they know what is expected. Another important aspect is designing triggers to avoid both over-escalation and under-escalation, because both can damage the program. Over-escalation overwhelms leadership and creates alert fatigue at the executive level, which can cause leaders to ignore important signals. Under-escalation keeps leaders uninformed until harm is severe, which creates crisis decisions and weak defensibility. A good balance comes from proportionality and layering, meaning operational teams handle routine fluctuations while leadership is involved when thresholds, impact, or external exposure make the decision enterprise level. This is where KRI design matters because KRI thresholds should be tuned to signal meaningful changes, not normal variation. It is also where control health matters, because control failure escalation can be a strong predictor of future harm and should be taken seriously. Another technique is to define different escalation levels, such as an internal review escalation versus leadership escalation. But even without formal levels, the idea is that not every signal is a leadership issue. Only signals that indicate unacceptable risk, high-impact exposure, or control breakdown should go upward. Beginners should practice distinguishing signal from noise by focusing on harm potential and tolerance boundaries. That habit will help you both on the exam and in real governance conversations. To make this concrete, imagine an organization using AI to assist in prioritizing customer complaints, including potential safety concerns. Drift monitoring shows that the distribution of inputs has shifted due to a new product release, and performance monitoring shows a rise in misclassification for a category associated with safety issues. Even if the overall error rate is not yet extreme, the impact context is high because safety harm is severe, so an impact escalation trigger could require leadership notification. If monitoring reviews are also being missed due to staffing shortages, that is a control failure trigger that strengthens the need for escalation because the organization's ability to detect harm is weakened. If a near miss occurs where a human catches a serious misclassification before harm occurs, that incident near miss could trigger escalation because it reveals the system is at the edge of tolerance. The escalation would route to leadership with a clear briefing that explains the risk, evidence trends, and options such as tightening human review for safety categories or temporarily disabling automation for those categories. Leadership could then decide on resource allocation, risk acceptance, and communication posture. This example shows how triggers work together, because real situations often include multiple signals, not just one. Beginners should see that escalation triggers are designed to capture exactly these converging conditions before a major incident forces reaction. To close, Creating escalation triggers is about defining when AI risk must rise from operational management to leadership decision-making, based on tolerance boundaries, impact severity, control health, incidents, and external exposure. Tolerance breach triggers activate when key risk indicators cross defined thresholds, signaling that residual risk may exceed acceptable limits. Impact triggers ensure that high-stakes contexts like critical decisions and safety roles receive leadership attention even when metrics are not yet dramatic, because consequence severity demands caution. Control failure triggers escalate when governance practices like monitoring, documentation, and review are not operating, because weak controls increase exposure and undermine defensibility. Incident triggers escalate confirmed harms and near misses, enabling coordinated response and corrective action, while external exposure triggers recognize that regulatory inquiries, audits, vendor changes, and public scrutiny require leadership involvement. Effective triggers include clear routing, required briefing content, and timelines, and they are designed to balance signal and noise so leadership receives actionable information without fatigue. When escalation triggers are defined and followed, monitoring becomes meaningful, risk tolerance becomes enforceable, and the organization becomes more resilient because it can act early rather than react late. That completes this set of Domain 2 operational skills by showing how monitoring, controls, risk registers, and governance culminate in timely leadership decisions that protect people, trust, and the organization's mission.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.